Sweet.
It's insurance for me. I started ahead of time.
And you don't edit this, right?
No.
Power book recently.
I thought she was getting another, getting a pad.
She's got one of those too. She's got an iPad and a power book. Anyway, she wanted to say, well, she goes, I guess I better learn the new iMovie. You open up iMovie and try to do anything and it crashes. You try to hook up the camera and import it, it crashes. You try to import a photo, it crashes.
Well, I think that's better anyway.
Should we take the podium while speaking, or can we speak from our seat?
I think I don't think Charles and CCTV people are set up. I suspect from my days as a television person that they haven't walked alone.
You need to use the microphone because the microphone is the audio.
How about that camera person?
No, it smokes. One thing I would say is, why don't you make your 7-minute presentations up there? Then you say that like
we always do. Well, we didn't ever lose.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. Does this work? This was working. Is it? No, I'm asking. Oh, that you did fix it. I will give you credit. Unlike the presidential debate, where people blame you on anything bad, don't give you credit for anything good. We'll do the reverse. All right. Thank you. Welcome. I'm Russ Beaton, Salem City Club president, and welcome to you all today to what we hope will be an interesting and informative program on ballot measure 80. A couple of announcements. First of all, our next event that we are co-sponsoring with the League of Women Voters will be next Tuesday evening, October 2nd, the All Candidates Forum. It will be at the Grand Theater from 7 to 8:30 p.m. And just a point of information, we had originally shot for October 3rd to start, and then we realized that's the night of a presidential debate, and we may not have much hope of getting you all there that evening. So consider the Candidates Forum the night before the presidential debate as a warm-up for that big event. Somewhere between an invitation and a plea for City Club members to step forward and become involved in our committee structures and exciting things like that. So as always, if you would like to become more involved in the superstructure, I can guarantee you it does not give you a tremendous feeling of power, but in governing the City Club, you are more than welcome. Please contact me or any board member. Our future programs, on our regularly scheduled programs on the Fridays, 2 weeks from today, we will be doing an examination, much as we are today in ballot measure 80, of the casino, privately owned casino ballot measure. Following that, we have another debate between our candidates for the Oregon Secretary of State office. And then immediately after the election, of course, our normal wrap-up with Ed Dover, Professor of Political Science at Western Oregon, who will tell us what we just saw in the election. That will be the Friday immediately following the election. So again, welcome today, and I will at this point turn it over to City Club member Ed Lesage, who will introduce our guests.
Thank you, Russ. There's a couple of items of business that I want to take care of, and as well, I've been asked by the program committee to provide a little context for Measure 80 and this debate, which I will do, and hopefully briefly. It was our intention to get a third speaker today to provide a legislative and policy history of legalizing and decriminalizing marijuana, as well as talking about some of the aspects of medical marijuana. We couldn't find someone that satisfied our requirements, and so you're stuck with me, who hopefully will provide a brief and reasonably accurate summary to bring you up to what today's discussion is about. If not, hi-ho. Let me just briefly talk, however, about the debate format. This debate follows a prescribed format that City Club of Salem has developed for the debate of measures, which is different than a debate between candidates. We will provide each one of the presenters 7 minutes. They can take it all or not. That's up to them. This gives a good run at the issue, both pro and con. Following that, the moderator will ask 2 questions, his election. However, these questions have been developed by members of the program committee as well as the moderator, and following on the presentations, I will use my judgment and choose a couple. Each one of the respondents has 2 minutes to reply to the questions. Then we have an opportunity for each of the questioners to ask one another a question. That's when the gloves usually come off, and it's kind of fun. We then have closing 2-minute remarks from our presenters, and then audience questions. Since there are any number of you here, and since this you are bound to have many questions, what we are going to do is to run this to the end of the CCTV taping, which is an hour. Stop it. For those of you who have to leave, you can. And then both of our presenters have agreed that they will stay for a few more questions. We will usually run about 15 minutes, and then we'll cut it off in the interest of their own requirements and to keep the buzz going, I guess. Well, let's hope. All right. These debates are timed, and by the way, that was intentional. Yeah, just testing. This debate is timed, and strictly so. Bob Zeigen, Bob, could you? There you go. Will time each one of the sessions with 1 minute to go. The green card comes up. With 30 seconds to go, a yellow card comes up, and here's the punchline with a red card, timeout. I will, as moderator, remind the presenters that the red card has come up, and the presenters will graciously stop speaking. The good thing about our format is that you can always get your digs, those things not said at the end of the time, in the audience questions or in the summaries. And it's a forgiving and actually a brilliant format for that. And again, I say that to the audience and to the presenters. So that roughly is what the setup is. Let me then, before I introduce our speakers, give you a brief, hopefully, legal and policy history leading up to Measure 80, the Oregon Cannabis Taxation Act. As I said, we thought it appropriate to try to have a independent speaker. We couldn't, so here is a brief summary culled from newspaper articles and other forms of information that will give you a little background of what this, I guess, is about. There's a couple things to note, though. First of all, that state and federal governments share jurisdiction over criminal law and legal administration of drug-related matters. And that, of course, becomes quite significant in this debate. And in this, the federal government, through the Federal Supremacy Clause, possesses powers that trump those of the state, where there is shared jurisdiction. And also it has administrative discretion that can confound or aid the efforts of the state in these types of matters. The other thing to note is that, like all truly significant policy matters, the issue of decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana is what some political scientists will call temporarily punctuated, which means simply that, like volcanoes or Halley's Comet, it's active sometimes and not. But the significant thing is for tough social issues, it always comes back, as you will see has been the case with the decriminalization and legalization of marijuana. One thing is clear, though, is that there's a motor behind these, there's an issue behind these, and when they come again, it usually means that the issues have not been resolved. The real question that everyone has to ask is, what is the issue? And often that is precisely and fully what the debate is about, as I think it will be today. What's the issue? Now, for purposes of the story of the history, you can look at this as really two broad, intertwined policy focuses. One is the decriminalization or the legalization of the possession and production of marijuana products, and the second is the authorization of marijuana as a medical remedy. Measure 80, the Oregon Cannabis Taxation Act, today's subject, it really deals with the first, which is decriminalization and legalization. The debate that we had 2 years ago over Measure 74 dealt with the other issue, that was attempting to change the legislation that had to deal with medical marijuana. Why don't we talk about the first and the history of it. In 1973, Oregon was the first state to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of marijuana, which is to say it was the first to depart from felony-level penalties for possession of small amounts of the substance. And in effect, it made it possession of small amounts an ounce a misdemeanor with a small fine. Not an infraction. Okay, not a crime at all. More coming when Joss gets up. In 1986, Measure 5 sought to go much further in legalizing the personal use and cultivation of marijuana by adults. And that measure had some of the same elements that are in today's measure. For example, persons 18 years or older would not be subjected to criminal penalties or fines or forfeitures, or to permit or license requirements for the private possession or growing of marijuana solely for personal use. State would provide defense for certain criminal charges, and the law was constructed so that if one part of that proposed act was struck down by the courts, the remainder of the law would remain. Measure 5 failed. In 1997, the legislature passed, and Governor Kinshaber signed a bill that would reimpose criminal penalties, including jail, for the possession of small amounts of marijuana. And in the following year, 1998, at the general election, the public voted by a margin of 2-1 to reject the 1997 legislation reinstating the criminal penalties. And in addition to that, the voters supported Measure 67, that authorized the restricted use of medical marijuana. So a banner year in this history was 1998. In the interval since 1998, 1998, Oregon's policy on possession and control of marijuana has remained defined by the 1973 legislation, except in the case of the medical use of the substance. Thus, Measure 80, the one that we're discussing today, represents something significant on the ballot, since it provides the public with an opportunity to examine its attitudes towards the prohibition and control of the substance. I will not go into the details and specifics of Measure 80 because our hope is that our presenters will give you broad outlines, and also it is our hope that you will read the legislation itself after this event. It's available in various sites, but Measure 80 and the formal name of the legislation will get you to it. Again, it's fascinating reading. A little bit about the career of medical marijuana, which is that there have been two efforts through initiatives to expand the Oregon Medical Marijuana Act beyond the bounds of its 1998 Measure 97. Those are a measure that put before the public in 2004, and then a measure put before the public in 2010. Both of these measures proposed some form of production and distribution for patients and also sought to minimize sales. Both of these were defeated. The other thing that I'll note is that there has been foment in the legislature from time to time around attempting to deal with the Oregon Medical Marijuana Act. For example, in 2009, there were 16 bills that were proposed. I don't know how many even got to committee or out of committee, and in 2011, there were 11 that were proposed. Since the initial enactment of the Medical Marijuana Act, the amount of marijuana that can be held by cardholders has increased a bit. Alzheimer's disease patients have been added to the list of those qualifying for cards, and police have been excused from prolonged storage of confiscated plants. And as of July 2012, it's reported that there are about 54,000 patients with cards and about 27,000 caregivers under the Act. All right, in summary, just a couple of things that I want to mention. First of all, the federal government lists marijuana, or more accurately, and I hope I get this right, tetrahydrocannabinol. I thought so. I practiced that for 2 hours last night. Also known, thankfully, as THC, as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substance Act. These drugs that are under Schedule I are deemed to have high potential for abuse, possess no currently accepted medical use, and for which there is a lack of accepted safety for the use of the drug under medical supervision, unquote. The list includes a rogues gallery of opiates, stimulants, and hallucinogenic and psychedelic substances. Federal law makes it illegal to manufacture or dispense or possess with intent to manufacture, distribute, or dispense these substances unless specifically authorized. In other words, they are highly prohibited. The other finishing point is 2 other states besides Oregon in this general election have legislation that is similar, if not exact, to Measure 80, and you will be able to find out how they do in the upcoming election. But also, I would encourage you, if you have any interest in this subject, to follow the debates in those states, because they parallel those in Oregon, but in the same instance may be different and may help edify you on the issue. So, a brief history of where we were and where we are. We have 2 speakers today, and I want to thank them on behalf of the City Club for responding to our invitation. These gentlemen have debated more than once and discussed this issue. Last week, they were at the City Club of Portland. I think that their arguments are sharpened, and we benefit, I think, from those previous arguments. They know one another well. I don't know if they buy one another drinks or not, but then not so. Paul Stanford is the chief petitioner for Measure 80. He founded and manages the nation's largest medical marijuana clinic. He serves as a court expert witness on marijuana and has made numerous media appearances as well as producing a variety of media products. Josh MARQUIS is the district attorney of CLATSOP County, Oregon. He's a distinguished in his professional organization service at both the state and the national levels, and he's a frequent guest on national radio, television programs in discussing the criminal justice programs and society. So that sets you up. The drill, again, is that we will start with Paul Stanford, who will give you 7 minutes of his best shot explaining Measure 80, and from that we will go to Josh. Paul?
Good afternoon, Salem City Club members and civic leaders and esteemed guests. Proud to be here this afternoon to represent Measure 80, which is a historic opportunity for Oregon and the nation to bring sensible thinking to the issue of how we interact with and manage the marijuana market. I'd like to start with a piece of history that helps us understand the situation. Back in 1932, Oregonians voted to end the failed policy of alcohol prohibition. Oregonians personally understood that regardless of whether they consumed alcohol or even supported the alcohol industry's existence, alcohol wasn't going anywhere, and prohibition was the worst way to deal with it. So they changed their mind and decided to regulate alcohol. Note that I said 1932. Federal prohibition of alcohol wasn't overturned until 1933. And many in the status quo movement said that Oregon couldn't possibly move first and expect the federal government to follow. But follow they did. Bring us to today. In 2010, Oregon's wine industry is a nearly $3 billion a year industry, employing more than 10,000 men and women with jobs in agriculture, food, processing, marketing, finance, and retail services. And Oregon's beer industry is more than $2 billion a year, employing thousands and bringing and keeping money in our state. These same industries were once illegal and are now the pride of our state, and not because of some miraculous cosmic shift or because the federal government acted first. It's because Oregon voters saw that what we were doing wasn't working, and they were willing to do something different. In that spirit of acknowledging the facts and using common sense, Oregon's Measure 80 simply says that marijuana prohibition has failed in Oregon and across the nation, and we have an opportunity to fix it. It's a long-standing failure. We can regulate a market that isn't going anywhere and create jobs, new tax revenue, and a sensible policy. Oregon Measure 80 will regulate marijuana like liquor for adults 21 years of age or older, with sales only through state licensed stores, and with tough DUI penalties we already have in place. Our initiative will fund development of tests to detect marijuana more readily. When alcohol prohibition was ended, of course, there were no breathalyzer tests, and today we see we have numerous ways to detect alcohol. Measure 80 also introduces tough penalties, like felony charges for people who sell marijuana to minors, criminal misdemeanor charges for providing marijuana to minors, rules against consuming marijuana in public, just like alcohol is illegal, rules against taking it out of state that are more severe for people who are doing it on a commercial scale. It also limits the amount of marijuana that a person can purchase at any given time and over a period of time to discourage the illegal export. Measure 80 will also save Oregon tens of millions of dollars a year in public safety costs associated with enforcement of the failed marijuana laws, from police costs to court costs and jail costs, which means our cities and counties will have more of their budgets to focus on dangerous substances and dangerous offenders. Opponents of this sensible policy like Measure 80 want you to believe that the world will end, that the problem isn't that bad, that we can't possibly move forward ahead of the federal government. But they're wrong. When the states lead, the federal government will follow. And even our opponents won't tell you that the most important thing in this debate, they won't tell you that what we're doing now isn't working, or it is working, because it isn't working. Another argument you'll hear from the defenders of the failed status quo is that we don't have a marijuana policy failure here in Oregon. We have medical marijuana. We decriminalized marijuana, as Ed noted, in 1973. I'm here to tell you that those arguments don't really hold water, and here's why. As long as prohibition is the law of the land, Oregon medical marijuana patients, providers, and even our frontline law enforcement officers will always operate in a confusing web of conflicting state and federal laws. And while decriminalization was a necessary step, it's not sufficient, because decriminalization does nothing to diminish the marijuana black market. As long as marijuana is illegal, it'll be profitable and people will break the law to grow it, sell it, and get it to consumers. But when we end prohibition, and it's not really a question of if we're going to end prohibition, because it is going to end eventually. People like me aren't going anywhere. We're going to demand our freedom. But when we end it, marijuana, like other legal regulated markets, will become transparent, legitimate, and competitive. Regulating marijuana is not impossible, it's inevitable. Our state government regulates practically every industry because the alternatives don't work. Total deregulation is a bust. You can ask our neighbors in California what they thought of the deregulated energy industry. Prohibition doesn't work. We can ask the millions of Americans who are incarcerated simply for using or growing or selling marijuana. So how will we regulate marijuana with Measure 80? We'll establish an industry commission made up of 7 members. The first year, all 7 of those members will be appointed by the governor, by Governor Kitzhaber. And they'll come from the agricultural industry, the medical community, the legal field. Maybe you've read the Oregonian's editorial board statement on Measure 80 and have questions about the commission. Maybe the Oregonians tried to scare you by using terms like marijuana grower. Well, let me tell you this. Are you scared of grass seed growers that dominate the grass seed industry? Are the Christmas tree growers that dominate the Christmas tree industry? I think a better term might be gardeners. The fact is, illegal marijuana growers don't want Measure 80 to pass. They love to see Measure 80 fail because Measure 80 will cripple the black market and bring legitimate legal competition to the marketplace. When we repeal prohibition and regulate marijuana sensibly, Oregonians will have businesses, jobs, invest in the community, and restore hemp for fuel, fiber, and food. That's why I believe the biggest opportunity when we pass Measure 80 is the reality is Oregon farmers will be the biggest beneficiaries. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me and allowing me to drive these 7 hours to and from Astoria today. Forgive me if my voice is a little rough. I got a bit of a cold. I want to make clear that I don't consider marijuana the demon weed. And I want to go back a little bit to that history because it's very important. In 1973, marijuana was decriminalized. In Oregon, all crimes are called offenses. There's 3 categories of them: felonies, for which you can go to prison; misdemeanors, for which you can go to jail; and infractions, for which you cannot go to jail. And if ever asked a question, have you ever been convicted of a crime, you can answer no. Speeding tickets are infractions. Marijuana, the man who did it was a guy named Pat Horton, who's long since retired from political life. He was my boss. He was the Lane County District Attorney in Eugene. And he did something really radical in 1973. And it was the kind of thing, with all due respect, Paul was way too young then anyway, but it was something that frankly only a law enforcement person probably could have gotten away with, which was to step forward and say, this is crazy, when we have people, and the idea, the law since then, and I did not support, by the way, the recriminalization in 1997. It's one of the reasons it was defeated so soundly, as very few law enforcement supported it. I think it was a stupid idea. The idea of decriminalization that Pat came up with in '73, and I wrote many of his speeches, and it was considered totally radical in the United States at the time, it's been picked up, was that the casual and incidental use of marijuana was radically different than the use of other drugs like heroin and methamphetamine, which wasn't that common then except in biker gangs, and cocaine. And that when young people at college at the University of Oregon, which dominates Eugene, were arrested for possession of a couple joints, they faced felony charges. That could ruin their life. I mean, they couldn't become lawyers or baker, I mean, anything that required registration. So with that interesting, diversion, I've forgotten about the 1997 attempt. It did get crushed. But that's very important that Oregon for almost 40 years now has decriminalized marijuana. And an ounce, I see, I can't resist. I see several golden marijuana leaves in the audience, and Paul showed up with a bit of a posse, and he's got signs over here. I know I got nobody with me. Just before you've had a chance, could I just get a sense by raising your hands, how many of you, before you've heard both of us finish speaking, support Measure 80? Just raise your hand if you support Measure 80. About 2/3, would you say, Paul? Okay. All right. Okay. And let me ask another question, and I'll try not to be too boring. How many of you, I won't have a chronic condition of some kind for which you either do take medication or could if you wanted to? Okay. You're all eligible for an Oregon medical marijuana card, if you don't have one already. In fact, an Oregon medical marijuana card is easier to get than a driver's license. And the one thing I think Paul and I will agree on is that the medical marijuana is a disaster. It's the one thing that Oregonians are a compassionate people, and I believe it's absurd that marijuana is scheduled as a Schedule I drug. It should be a Schedule II drug. I've been advocating this for over 8 years. Doctors should prescribe it. It should be available in pharmacies, and growers like Paul and other people can grow really good weed. When I was at the University of Oregon in the 1970s, I'm very nostalgic about the smell of marijuana. It reminds me of going around the University of Oregon campus where I used to smell it frequently. But the marijuana that my friends smoked back then, and I didn't mainly because I worked in the DA's office and I thought it was hypocritical, was 2% THC. It's tetrahydrocannabinol 9, by the way, is how it's pronounced. Paul could do me one better, I'm sure, as a grower. That marijuana was about 2%. If you had to mostly smoke a joint in order to get high, get a buzz. Now the marijuana that's being grown is 20 to 30% THC. I mean, you're talking about literally 1,000% more potent. Now, Paul's argument is, oh, you'll just use less of it. Unfortunately, in alcohol, that doesn't usually work. We don't usually find people going, oh, well, this is a much stiffer drink, so I'll just only have one of them. They have more. There are a number of problems with the Oregon Medical Marijuana Act. One is that it just blows the doors off legalization. I mean, Mr. Lesage talked about the medical marijuana, and I think the one thing that Paul makes clear is this has nothing to do with medical marijuana. In fact, I believe he called it a failed system, and I would agree. You have 55,000 recipients. Anybody can have 1.5 pounds of marijuana. Do you have any idea how much dope that is? And if you, by the way, drop down to just 1 pound and in an emergency, then you can stock back up to 1.5 pounds, which means you can stay stoned 24/7, probably 30 days out of the month. So all you'd have to do is go to a doctor, and not every doctor will do this, and say, Josh Marquis' bad knees could, benefit from marijuana, and then I take that card and I go to a marijuana grower who may or may not be in it for the money, and that person and I can possess 1.5 pounds. The Oregonian did several very interesting news articles about some of the real outrages. For example, drug dealers are prohibited, but not sex criminals from being involved in it. So you have there's a lot of misuse of it. If we're to do something, what we need to do is convince the federal government to reschedule marijuana. I'm just looking at the Huffington Post, most recent article that talked about the conviction of a guy who sounds, I'm not trying to scare Paul, much like Paul, his name is, he probably knows him, Chris Williams in Montana, who was just convicted. It was the largest grower of dispensaries. They have a law similar to the one in Oregon. A federal jury just convicted him. He's going to prison. Now, I don't think that's right, but that's the federal law. And the article in the Huffington Post basically was asking President Obama, who's running for re-election, and it said, since then, the administration, meaning the Obama administration, has unleashed an interagency cannabis crackdown that goes beyond anything seen under the Bush administration, with more than 100 raids, primarily on California pot dispensaries, many of them operating in full compliance with state law. Since October 2009, the Justice Department has conducted more than 170 aggressive SWAT-style raids in 9 medical marijuana states. So make no mistake, when you're messing with the federal supremacy clause, you're not just going to say, oh, well, you know, they'll just go away because we'll show them the way. And the comparison to the Volstead Act is foolish. Remember what that was. You had liquor, which was an absolutely legal substance manufactured everywhere, that all of a sudden got made illegal. It was a wildly unpopular act, and it was a complete disaster. Marijuana has been illegal pretty much since 1937 and before then. So, and also, lastly, this marijuana commission he's talking about, 5 of the 7 members are required to be marijuana growers.
And now 2 questions, and we will time our speakers 2 minutes each, and I will start with Paul. And this is the question. If you agree that it is useful and desirable that THC be reclassified as a federal Schedule II drug, then what is the best way to proceed to affect this change? And I've asked the speakers, they suggest that they can sit and respond. Paul?
I think the other substances in the Schedule 2 are a little bit, just not on.
Testing. I'm going to ask for this. Hold it down. Okay. Huh? We're in business.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
There you go.
You can hear that now?
Yep. Yep.
All right. I don't think cannabis should be Schedule II. I think if it's going to be scheduled, it should be Schedule 4 or 5. All the other substances in Schedule II can be toxic. Cannabis is not toxic. There's no lethal overdose. They have a regimen where they test drugs, and they have what they call LD50. That's a lethal dose for 50% of the people who take it. All the other substances that are in Schedule II have an LD50. For instance, there are a lot of substances that are lethal without being in Schedule II. If you take 13 aspirin, you're going to die, on an average. So cannabis, I believe, should be, if it's going to be scheduled, Schedule 4 or 5. So I think that it should be regulated like Measure 80 recommends.
You're on. You can just talk.
Working out? Okay. You know, dream on. I understand a marijuana grower would say it's, you know, Tylenol is an incredibly toxic drug. If you take too much of it, it will destroy your liver. In fact, it's a real serious problem. You can buy buckets of it wherever you want without any. The LD50, by the way, is, thank God it's never done with human beings. LD50 testing on drugs is done on animals, whether that's offensive or not. I agree. I mean, marijuana, I don't think marijuana ever killed anybody unless a big bale fell over and hit them. But if we're going to be realistic, with the Obama administration kicking down doors in California, let's agree on something reasonable and something that we can actually sell, which is like saying, okay, this is a drug, which I think Paul calls relatively non-addicting. I'm sorry, I know people who are still on the same couch at the U of O in the same blue haze they were that when I left in 1980. Now, you know, they're not doing that much harm, but it is a drug.
Okay, second question. How would the passage of these measures, of Measure 80, affect the cultivation and sale of Oregon, in Oregon by foreign drug cartels?
Foreign drug cartels would not be involved in it at all. It would license farmers, gardeners to grow cannabis. It would equitably distribute the licenses among all applicants, so no one large farmer would dominate the market. It would impose strict penalties for growing it illegally without a license or providing it to minors. We designed this to be upheld in federal court, and so it's designed to go through a process much like our Death with Dignity law that passed in 1994, was enjoined in the federal courts. It went through a fast track and came before the United States Supreme Court in 1996, and they upheld it in Gonzalez versus Oregon. We designed this law to be upheld in federal court in three ways. First, we impose a system of controls that's mandated by the Single Convention Treaty. The license requirements are directly lifted from international treaties. The first third of the text are findings by the people that are the sovereign, the rulers in our system. So the Supreme Court would have to take that into consideration. And so we designed it to deal with the federal issue, and we funded that through applicants' license fees. So people who buy a license to cultivate, process, or sell marijuana, those licenses would be used to defend the act, and it wouldn't come out of the general fund.
Well, let me give you a little anecdote. For 15 years, I'm still on the board of the National District Attorney Association. I represented Oregon. And one of my trips to the DEA center down in Tucson, which tries to regulate the border, where massive amounts of all kinds of drugs come over. I was in a big warehouse where coyotes bring over illegal aliens and not only make them pay $2,000, but now make them often wear a pack made of burlap of marijuana. And I was poking around with some other prosecutors, and a DEA agent walked up to me and said, and I was obviously sort of turning up my nose at the quality of the dope, and he was saying, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Oregon." "Why?" He says, "Well," I said, "Where's this stuff going?" He says, "Not to the Pacific Northwest." And the point is, the marijuana and it's a huge. The cartels will smuggle anything. Heroin, methamphetamine is actually their biggest crop by far, and marijuana. But the marijuana that's grown in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia and California is far, far better. Also, on the Death with Dignity Act, that is a complete red herring. I was very supportive both times of the idea. The Death with Dignity Act was where Alberto Gonzales, Bush's first Attorney General, tried to get in between doctors and a drug that is currently a Schedule II drug, sodium pentobarbital, usually, which is the drug that if somebody passes the qualifications can be administered and they can end their own life. This is a drug that is outside of a doctor's ability to prescribe.
Now comes even more fun. Speaker A gets to ask Speaker B a question, and Speaker B responds. Paul, a question to Josh, and Josh, you have 2 minutes, and then Paul has a rebuttal. Yes, that's right.
Under the current approach, which combines regulation with education and enforcement, according to the Monitoring the Future study in 2012, alcohol and tobacco use among teens is now at a historic low, while the use of marijuana is at a historic high. With that information in mind, do you really believe that prohibition is a more effective model than regulation and control?
I don't necessarily think the current model is the best one, but the only reason that marijuana is so widely available now is primarily because of the so-called medical marijuana program, and that you have so many people that are able to possess such a large quantity of it, and the fact that it's a weed. Unlike tobacco, OxyContin, vodka, homebrew, I mean, yes, you can make homebrew. It's a lot of work. You can make wine. It's a lot of work. Anybody can grow marijuana. You don't need a lot of work.
Rebuttal.
It takes quite a few months to grow marijuana. It's not that easy to grow. Many medical patients fail in their crop. The weather greatly affects it. The same that microbrewers, they brew at home or make their own wine, aren't out in the streets trying to sell it. We won't see illegal growers selling marijuana when we regulate it. We used to have to worry about going and hiking in the hills back during alcohol prohibition because there were stills out there and moonshiners might shoot you. These days you have to worry about hiking up in the mountains and hills if marijuana growers are up there. We need to regulate this market. You know, people can grow their own tobacco, but I've never known anyone who's actually done that. And the brewers I know who make their own beer have to continue to buy it at stores, and it's regulated.
Now you get to ask Paul a question.
All right, time for, my gross income is $113,000 a year. I'm employed by both the state and the county. That amount does not go up or down depending on how many marijuana busts or heroin busts or anything else. I'd like to ask Paul what his gross income is and how it's related to the sale and cultivation of marijuana and hemp.
My gross income's $85,000 a year through the clinics where our doctors help patients get a medical marijuana license. I grow medical marijuana and I give it away for free under Oregon's medical marijuana law. Our initiative would regulate that and would mandate that cannabis be sold to medical patients untaxed. I think the price will come down to $10, $20 an ounce. And the taxed marijuana, instead of its current value of $200 to $400 an ounce, will come down to $50 to $100 an ounce. The difference will be state revenue. So I employ a lot of doctors that make a lot more than I do.
Paul's foundation used to be nonprofit. That nonprofit status was taken away because it was determined that he was paying for apparently personal expenses. And I believe he's facing, although I think he's fighting at a $64,000 fine from Kate Brown's office. So,
there was another marijuana initiative that was fined $65,000. They did not make the ballot. That was initiative number 24. And I have not been fined by the Secretary of State. And that was another initiative. Unfortunately, it's pretty easy to confuse who knows how many marijuana initiatives there are. Ours was the one that qualified.
I'm going to give you 10 seconds if you want to. All right, that's it. The honorable gentleman ceded to the other honorable gentleman. That's the way. Isn't that wonderful? Anyway, let us now move to closing remarks. I'll ask Paul to begin. He has 2 minutes, and then Josh has 2 minutes. Gentlemen.
The number one reason that Americans have suffered through 40 years of this failed war on marijuana is not because of public safety. It's because for 40 years we've been told that even to question the sanity of what we're doing is shameful and unpatriotic. But after trillions of dollars wasted and countless lives ruined, we can no longer really be intimidated. We have to stand up and say what we're doing is failed and we need a new approach. When we talk about reforming our laws, we're often told, what message are we sending our kids? Well, what message are we sending our kids? It's spending more and cutting on jails and cutting education, forcing more parents and students alike to go into debt for school while we continue to lock up more people in prisons for nonviolent offenses. You know, right now we have more people in jail in this country than any country in the history of the world, not just currently, but any other country. About twice the number of people are imprisoned here than are imprisoned in Russia. And it's easier for kids to get marijuana than it is to get liquor. Why? Because we regulate liquor. We educate about liquor. Alcohol use is at a historic low as a result of regulation and education, which is exactly what we will do with Measure 80, regulate and educate. Currently, 8 out of 10 kids in Oregon say marijuana is easy to get, and 3 out of 10 kids say alcohol is easy to get. And street dealers don't ask for ID. 8 out of 10 have access to drug dealers that don't ask for ID. That's what prohibition has done. So here's what Measure 80 does. It takes an extensive market that's prevalent now and brings it under state control, directs the money from the tax revenue for marijuana sales toward education in the general fund. It creates drug treatment programs with 7% of the proceeds and a comprehensive, realistic drug education program with 1%.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring us back to a reality in Oregon where we get to vote. We don't get to vote on federal law. Maybe we should, but we don't. This is an Oregon ballot measure. I urge you to read it. In fact, I urge you to go to his website. That's where I printed it off of. Read the initiative. Basically, it says that hemp and marijuana is the best thing since anything. I mean, hemp, it will cure your lumbago, your impotence, whatever it is, hemp and marijuana will do that for you. Now, he can say that there's all this money being spent on law enforcement. There are 14,500 people in prison in Oregon. You know how many are there for possessing marijuana? 6. And they're all plead downs from manufacturing. In Oregon, as we talked about, possession of less than an ounce, you can't even get arrested. I mean, it's not, you never get a record. Most marijuana possession charges, the judge is maxed out at 10 days in jail as a maximum fine under Oregon sentencing guidelines. When you look at the 50 states in this country, the #1 state in terms of the smallest percentage of nonviolent offenders in prison is Oregon. #1. We have 68% of those in prison are violent offenders. We literally can't be better than any other state. So this idea that this is a solution in search of a problem. I didn't come here today and tell you it's unpatriotic to do what Paul's doing or that marijuana is the devil weed. This is just a highly flawed solution. It doesn't say how much marijuana can be kept by any one of these distributors. It doesn't say what the tax is going to be, and there's no enforcement structure like there is all the CDC. Now, he may say, oh, well, don't worry, the legislature will fix that. You would never tolerate that if I brought a sentencing initiative to you and said, let's lock everybody up for 2 years, and they say, oh, don't worry, you can fix it with the legislature later.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. And our spirited debate will, I think, become even more spirited because now it's time to take questions from the audience. 2 points. First of all, do use the microphone. The reason we need you to do that is so that we can get your question on the CCTV broadcast. And the second thing is no speeches, cut to the chase, ask the question, and that allows others to get their turn as well as it allows these gentlemen to understand what you're asking. So, questions? Go ahead.
David Higgins, City Hall. Hemp fiber used to be a wonderful resource for anything. The Royal Navy used it extensively when they were a sailing navy, and I'm wondering how useful would hemp fiber be today, and could we just use it and still disregard the marijuana?
Let me answer first, because my answer will probably be quicker and easier. Yes, you could. Male hemp, I think Paul can address this better than I. He's a grower, he knows it, is a basically doesn't have very much THC in it. And yes, hemp itself is a very useful substance. It could be used for all kinds of things. Female marijuana or female hemp is marijuana, and it can, depending on how it's grown, have a considerable THC content.
According to the law, the stems and sterile seeds of cannabis or marijuana is legal, and that's hemp. But the leaves and the flowers and the viable seeds are illegal, and that's marijuana. Oregon, in the 2007 legislative session, passed a bill put through by assistant DA down in Lane County, Floyd Przanski. He'd been working on it for over a decade.
Floyd hasn't been an assistant DA for 25 years, let's be clear on that.
Okay. Anyway, that bill went through, but the only way we can cultivate cannabis or industrial hemp is to grow dwarf hemp, which produces half the amount of fiber and 1/20th the amount of seed, oil, and protein. In Canada, they're allowed to grow this dwarf hemp, and it produces about 600 pounds of seeds per acre. There's a study on feral hemp here in the United States that shows that the wild hemp that grows along the Mississippi and Ohio river valleys produces about 8,000 pounds of seed per acre. In Canada, the seed is the crop that they're growing it for, the seed oil and the seed protein. You can find hemp seed oil and hemp foods in stores all across America. It's $1 billion a year crop, but it is not allowed to be produced here in the United States. So our initiative says that the varieties of cannabis that produce the most and the best hemp, seed oil, protein, and fiber, will be the ones that will be cultivated. So we believe that that will dwarf the drug market, that when we restore hemp in Oregon, we'll put Oregon on the cutting edge of exciting new sustainable developments. And I truly believe that hemp biodiesel fuel will be a main product that our farmers will get in on the ground level of. The whole reason that marijuana was prohibited wasn't really about drugs. You know, if they'd said they want to prohibit hemp, they never would have been able to do it. If they'd said they want to prohibit cannabis, the AMA came at the last minute and tried to stop, because they stopped the prohibition law that passed the federal government in 1937 because they didn't realize that marijuana was cannabis. So the only way they made it illegal was by using this new word, marijuana, and it was mainly to suppress the hemp fuel and hemp fiber markets. Henry Ford was producing auto bodies with hemp fiber and hemp oil, and the petrochemical companies didn't want to compete with that. So I really believe, and I think history will prove, that the main reason marijuana is illegal is to suppress hemp fuel and fiber.
Thank you.
Let me be clear, if this was about hemp production, I wouldn't be up here debating it. I really could care less about whether or not hemp is produced. And I apologize if I flared a little bit, but Floyd Przanski is not an assistant district attorney. He was for about 2 years in the late 1980s and early 90s. Yes, well, Floyd is the marijuana person's favorite ex-district attorney. He has stood in front in ads in every single marijuana campaign for the last 25 years. So I apologize if I jumped a little bit at that one.
Next question.
Iris Gibson, Salem City Club. My question is about the Oregon Cannabis Commission, which is put in charge of this measure. It puts commercial pot growers and producers in charge of the commission established to regulate them. And after the first year, 5 of the 7 members of the commission will be chosen by them. And I don't understand why this is this way.
Thank you.
When we go to the Board of Pharmacy, there are pharmacists that are in charge of the Board of Pharmacy. When we go to the Oregon Medical Association, there are doctors who are mandated to be there. The law on agricultural commissions here in Oregon is that 70% of their composition has to be made up of people in the industry. You know, at first when we drafted this law, we were going to put it under the control of the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. We did polling and showed there's a certain percentage of people who believe the OLCC is corrupt and that they would never put anything under their control. So we decided to create a separate commission. And you know, the OLCC, by the way, is entirely political appointees. And there's that feeling out there that they don't do that good a job of it. I don't know if I agree with that, but there are certain people who do.
Josh?
I think the questioner has a good point. I think it's absurd. Look, marijuana is not blueberries or filberts. Yeah, I mean, marijuana is a drug. I would not be driving 7 hours from Astoria to say, hey, think about this law if we were talking about, some new exotic berry that they were going to grow. This is not an agricultural product, it's a drug. And like all drugs, it can be used and without terribly much harm, and it can be abused. And I don't know where Paul gets, I'm very much on the ground level of enforcement. I'm in court every day, and I see alcohol abuse by our young people at a really distressing rate. I learned at a Rotary meeting recently that in my community that something like 30% of 11th graders had engaged in binge drinking in the last 30 days from the study, which I find absolutely horrifying. So, and I want to use that as an example. There's a regulated industry, alcohol, and what a great job we've done at keeping alcohol from kids. I don't think anybody can really look at an audience and say, look at what a great job we've done at keeping alcohol out of the hands of kids.
Okay. Next question.
Hi, I'm Gloria Holland, City Club member. I understand from your comments that what I'm going to ask has to go to the legislature, but certainly you must have some idea of how much revenue would come to the state of Oregon through the regulation, taxation, et cetera, with the legalization, with this passage of this measure. Thank you.
I have a degree in political economy, but I haven't really studied the issue that in depth. There's a gentleman at Harvard University, a professor there by the name of Jeffrey Myron. You can see his website, prohibitioncosts.com. And he says here in Oregon that we will see income from the profit from selling cannabis of about $140 million a year, and that it costs about $61.5 million a year to enforce cannabis laws. That includes for possession. He mentioned that it's just an infraction with no jail time to have 28 grams or less of marijuana, but when you have 29 grams or more, then that is a felony. In fact, in his county, so far this year, they've had 16 felony arrests for possession of over an ounce of marijuana. Last year, there were 20 total in 2011. Here in the state, there are about 200 arrests per month for possession of over 28 grams of marijuana. So we anticipate that we'll bring in about $200 million a year. That represents about 5% of the total state budget. And here in Oregon, we have 2,400 possession arrests for over 28 grams and another 4,500 arrests for selling or growing marijuana illegally. So we'll see a reduction in those costs and revenue.
I think it's very significant that there is not numbers I mean, generally speaking, if you have an industry, you can tell approximately whether it's wine or beer or Filberts, how much money is going to be generated. And that's one of the many things that's missing from here. Also, we have no idea what the tax rate is, how it's going to be enforced. They're going to be cannabis agents. Are they all going to be working for Paul? I mean, it's a whole bunch of this stuff. The idea that Paul, at the last debate, attributed $1 million of that cost to my county. My entire budget is $1.2 million. And I won't do this again because I can only get away with it like once. I think I handed him a $10 bill, which is the amount that I'm sure that my office spends aggressively going after marijuana possession. The fact of the matter, this is Oregon. For the most part, marijuana arrests are when cops trip over people, or one case that I personally prosecuted, somebody was growing way more plants than they should have, than they had a right to, in a place that they shouldn't. The sheriffs went up twice, said, please get your plants down. No. They refused. On the third time, we prosecuted them. I just do not see this as the harsh, world that he's trying to paint of all these people being thrown in jail.
Gentlemen and audience, we have run out of time for the formal program, so what I'd like to do is, first of all, to thank both of our presenters and for coming here, 7-hour drive, which probably seemed like a lot longer, 4-hour drive. I was going to ask you about that, actually. I know there's other questions in the audience, and so what we will do is we will turn the podium over to Russ, and then after his remarks, we will take questioning up for a few minutes afterwards. Russ?
Thank you very much. And from the City Club's perspective, again, thank both of you gentlemen for being here today. And this will end our formal presentation for the CCTV. On a personal note, on the conflict of interest front, when I was a kid, my folks both smoked, and it made me sick, actually, the smoke in the house. They later quit, but at a very early age, I developed a philosophical objection to putting a burning object in my mouth. And I retain that to this day. I don't know if that gives me a conflict of interest or if it absolves me from a conflict of interest, but either way, I wish to declare that. Oh. At this point,
you can consume marijuana.
exactly. At this point, additional questions from the audience.
Bob Zigan, City Club member. There are rules about smoking cigarettes so far from buildings if you're outside and smoking. Yet recently I walked by a restaurant and was quite overwhelmed by the smoke. The rules, I believe, says you got to smoke marijuana indoors. Well, that's a joke. People are going to smoke it outside. How will you protect me and other people like me from being exposed to marijuana smoke outside, short of having a lot of regulators standing around observing?
Well, unfortunately, there weren't any regulators to stop you from inhaling that tobacco smoke, I take it. But we create a fine and an infraction for using cannabis in public, a $250 fine. It's not insignificant, just like there's a law against using alcohol in public. So we tried to adjust that.
Yeah, you can't hear me. Good. My name is Rick Ritter. I'm not a member. The question I've got is, and to address, I haven't read the entire measure yet. How do you control the potency of the commercially grown marijuana under Measure 80? Thank you.
We direct the Board of Pharmacy to address the psychoactive components in cannabis, and we have a law that's in our Measure 80 that says the packages have to have a warning on the side of the packages that talk about the health risk from using marijuana, and that also denote the active ingredients in the package, just the way that you have to have a warning about the amount of alcohol in liquor and other drinks. We say that the packages have to be labeled with the constituent compounds.
One of my concerns also is that, again, the potency of marijuana makes a big difference. I mean, if you think of any pharmaceutical drug, if you're talking about, you can buy, if you ever go to Canada, they call them 222s. It's small amounts of codeine, and in Europe, it's generally allowed up to 8 milligrams, and the theory that it can't be that harmful. If you talked about 100 milligrams of codeine, you'd be talking about a much larger and substantial dose. Same drug, greater potency. It's not in here, and that's one of my concerns.
Mike Swaim, City Club. Maybe I missed it or didn't understand it, but what is the rationale for treating and regulating marijuana differently than from alcohol? It seems like they suffer from the same kinds of pluses and minuses. And second of all, Mr. Marquis, you said that, and I guess it was in Ms. Stanford's statement, that the state of Oregon repealed prohibition a year before the feds did. Your concern is, the state of Oregon taking initiative once again in a similar situation. Was there enforcement problems in that year before Congress
I wasn't
changed
around,
mind?
so I really can't tell you. My knowledge of history is that the Volstead Act was enormously unpopular from the moment it was passed. It was passed because of, basically, ironically, the suffragette movement and the prohibitionist movement that basically sort of ran through Congress. And so, but the reason I quoted that thing from the Huffington Post is I'm assuming that if you're for marijuana, you probably don't want Mitt Romney to be president. So let's just assume that Barack Obama gets reelected. The way he and his Justice Department are behaving, the idea to say, oh, we'll just pave the way and the rest of the country will come behind us is just nuts. Your alcohol as a drug is more dangerous, in my opinion, than alcohol. Don't get me wrong. If there is a drug that I could wipe out with snapping my fingers, it would probably be booze. But the Volstead Act didn't work, and alcohol has been legal and institutionalized for thousands of years. Marijuana has not been institutionalized for thousands of years, and the difference is that it is available, essentially both through the medical marijuana program and through the decriminalization. We're not like other states.
I just got to say that marijuana, hemp, cannabis is the oldest crop known to man. All archaeologists agree that hemp, cannabis was among the first crops purposely cultivated. If you go to the first agricultural civilizations in China on the Huanghe River, the Yellow River Valley, or in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, both of those civilizations cultivated cannabis, hemp, marijuana. And so it was one of the largest crops in the country until the invention of the cotton gin. In fact, the first laws about marijuana in the United States were from the British Empire, and they mandated anyone who had 40 acres or more of land had to grow 10% of their land with hemp and produce the seed oil. They called it oakum to coat the boards of their ships so they wouldn't leak. And for the ropes and sails, the canvas came from hemp. So Louis Armstrong, I'll tell you, was very upset when they prohibited marijuana. And it was being used. In fact, the word marijuana comes from the Pancho Villa Revolutionary War song, La Cucaracha, where they say the cockroach smokes marijuana. Well, I'll tell you, when the Mexicans took over that government in 1911, they nationalized the petroleum industry. And that's when the first marijuana laws started to appear in Texas. The oil barons didn't like it. And so they realized that it was a biofuel that could compete with petroleum products.
Jan Margosian, Salem City Club. I'm interested in current growers. This is a little off, but I just thought about it. Does it take a lot of water? Are we going to get into the organic gardening? Are you still going to have organic pot? I mean, it's just kind of interesting.
As a medical marijuana grower, I grow organically for my patients. And cannabis I've seen grow in China in standing water. At the same time, if you go out to Nebraska where they're just getting over a terrible drought, the Nebraska Fish and Wildlife Department says they don't want the police to harvest the feral wild hemp because the birds need that seed when the snow's covering the ground. It would wipe out the bird population. So currently, though, with the drought there, the only thing that's green are the hemp plants because the hemp stems go down as deep as the plant is tall. And so they're the only things that can reach the groundwater down 5, 10 feet below the soil at the surface. So it can grow in water. It's pretty hardy, but producing the flowers is not easy. They're prone to mold, and the flower crop takes a little bit of work. Just like producing good wine takes a little bit of work.
I'm sure some of you in the audience have some experience with seeing really good bud. It has a very distinctive look to it, feel to it, and you have to be a really good grower. But again, if this was just hemp we were talking about, or something to let the bird, we really wouldn't care. Again, we're talking about a drug, and we're talking about a drug when you're talking about 20, 25, 30% THC content. That is, it's a substantial drug. And, I think even Paul has recognized this by saying that the Board of Pharmacy needs to regulate the degree or at least label it. And to then all of a sudden, and Paul's done this a number of times in the debates, veer off and start talking about how great hemp is. I'm assuming hemp is wonderful. I'm fine. I don't care about all the hemp everywhere. And if the government, classifies it marijuana the same way, that's stupid.
Hans West, the Salem City Club. I'd like to bring up synthetic THC. And I realize it's become rather easy to manufacture. It's become a widely used drug. And there's not much regulation, is my belief at this point, or at least my understanding. The synthetic THC, it is similar to, but not identical to organic or grown THC. And it has unpredictable effects. They can be quite deleterious and serious. Does this measure 80, do anything to, say, open the door for that? Or does your group have any statements about synthetic? Do we need to distinguish it from the grown THC? Just a general question.
Synthetic THC is available pharmaceutically. The analogs that haven't been regulated, then they're made illegal. The chemists changed that a little bit. When marijuana is regulated and legally available for adults, I don't believe anyone will want to use those dangerous analogs and chemically different products. We don't address that directly, but we do regulate the marijuana market. And once it's legally available, I don't believe people will be looking for alternatives.
There is a pharmaceutical form, I think it's called cannabinol. It's a Schedule 2 or 3 drug. A lot of people, my mother, for example, who's 90 years old and has lost a lot of weight, has been prescribed it to help her appetite. And she could also get a marijuana card in California if she wanted to. If you're talking about the synthetic analogs that are sold in head stores, they're a real problem. They're sort of it's like bath salts. Unfortunately, people want to get high. And there are some people who want to do it very irresponsibly. And they're never going to be satisfied with, 10, 20% marijuana. They're going to want to get a different high. And, this will probably regulate, well, sort of. Again, read the measure. If there's regulation in there, I can't find it.
I'm Susan White. I'm not a member. I think the Assistant District Attorney made a statement earlier about that Measure 80 does not contain limits for crop yields. So my question is, do other crops in Oregon have yield limits?
Thank you for demoting me. I became the district attorney 19 years ago, but that's okay. Not that I'm aware of. Drugs and alcohol do. And really, I know I sound like a broken record here, but this is not Filbert's. This is not. There's a Filbert Commission, by the way, and a Blueberry Commission, and a Strawberry Commission. They actually exist. I know we have at least one state representative here who probably funds them. And they're all intended to encourage these Oregon agriculture. But I really think it's going a bit far to say that the Oregon Cannabis Act is just an agricultural initiative. It's intended to do something. And then again, we've been dodging this all day, is what are you going to do about when the Obama administration starts kicking doors like they're doing this week in Southern Oregon and Northern California? Again, this is not the Republican administration. This is not George Bush. This is Eric Holder and Barack Obama.
We anticipate that this law will be enjoined in federal court. The federal government didn't come in and enjoin the medical marijuana acts. They allowed them to go forward because people need medicine. I'm glad that passed. It took patients who need it off the battlefield in this war on drugs. I've seen multiple sclerosis patients be able to walk and move who previously had been totally seized up. When it comes to limits, we establish limits and say it has to be for personal use. It has to be, and if it's commercial, then that would be illegal, and we create new felony penalties for selling marijuana without a license, for providing it to minors, for exporting it from the state. So the limits we impose are for personal, private use, and anything beyond that would be illegal.
Is there one more question? If not, we will end it at that point. I would say to you, Paul, that when I was actively teaching economics, regional economics, I had several term projects over the years on the economic impact for Oregon of legalizing marijuana, and the results were significant, as I recall, although tracing down some footnotes, I had real trouble with figuring out where their sources really lay. Josh and Paul, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm sure we all learned a great deal. I declare this adjourned, and Josh can begin his trek back to Astoria. Thank you.